April 1982. A brigade of Argentine military forces assaulted the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. They faced just over 100 Royal Marines defending the islands. While overwhelmingly outnumbered and outgunned, the Marines fought back. The Argentines could not be stopped, but they could be hurt. And the Marines inflicted considerable casualties. They only laid down their arms when the island's governor ordered a surrender, in large part to avoid further civilian casualties. The British surrendered, but their spirited defense of the islands galvanized the British people. In a few hours of combat, the Royal Marines proved the British still had the fortitude to be a force to be reckoned with. When British forces returned to the islands, the Royal Marines went on to serve with distinction, continuing a legacy begun more than 300 years earlier. Initially established in 1664 as the Duke of York and Albany's Maritime Regiment of Foot, the Marines have seen action in most of Britain's overseas campaigns. By tradition, the first Marines served aboard ships of the Royal Navy as sharpshooters, gunners, and infantry for landing parties. Not unlike their modern counterparts, the earliest Marines had to be flexible. At sea, they fought as an integral part of the Royal Navy. When deployed in strength on land, they came under the command of the Army. They lived up to their name as the soldiers of the Navy. Their long history included the daring raid to capture the seemingly impregnable fortress of Gibraltar, the action to control Belle Isle off the coast of Brittany, the Battle of Bunker's Hill during the American War of Independence, the decisive battle victory over Napoleon at Trafalgar, and the Boxer Rebellion in China at the turn of the 20th century, where they fought alongside the American Marines. Important as their mission was in the early years, the origins of the modern Marine Commando grew out of lessons learned in action against two wartime enemies, the South African Boers and the Germans. In the South African Wars, Dutch farmers formed small but highly mobile strike teams called commandos. These units played havoc with British forces. Although the Boers were generally despised for their unconventional techniques, certain officers respected and learned from the tactics used by the fast-moving farmers on horseback who had successfully hindered the movement of British forces. Later, in the desperate battles of the First World War, where success on the battlefield was measured in meters gained or lost, thousands of men were killed or badly wounded each and every day. The movement of thousands of men repeatedly resulted in large numbers of casualties. The sheer bulk of the armies on both sides proved to be almost impossible to manage. In an attempt to break the deadlock at the end of the war, the Germans created small groups of highly trained and highly motivated men whose task it was to use cunning and creative tactics to punch through Allied lines. The Germans called these units Stoßtruppen, or shock troops. The tide had already turned against the Germans on the Western Front, but the concept begun with the shock troops would long be remembered by some in the British Army. During the war, the Marines served at sea manning guns and in the trenches as part of the Royal Naval Division. One high point of their service was participating in the Allied raid on Zeebrugge in 1918. The British naval and military units, like those in the rest of the world, believed the Great War meant the end to wholesale killing by civilized nations. Certainly, Britain would need to keep the lines of communication open throughout the Commonwealth, and to suppress the occasional colonial outburst. This would take troops, but not the massed armies necessary to fight a full-scale war. The brilliant summer of 1939 ended with the German invasion of Poland and the end of hopes for a future without war. Despite the warning signals, Britain had just begun to seriously rearm and prepare itself for war. By the September of 1939, a small research contingent had been established in the War Office, charged with developing new tactics. Mindful of the German shock troops developed in the First War, it was suggested that British guerrilla teams be established. In these early days of the war, before Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, the military establishment seldom embraced such revolutionary ideas, particularly those considered to be somewhat unsportsmanlike or underhanded by British standards. However, the urgency of war prevailed, and 10 independent companies of specially trained men were created. They were designated to fight in Finland, then in the midst of a bitter winter war with Russia. The Soviets defeated the Finns before help could arrive, and the independent companies prepared to go to Norway instead. The campaign there was short-lived, too little, too late. But the men demonstrated determination and ingenuity before withdrawing to Britain to continue their guerrilla training. All this was being done on a small scale. The War Office had not yet made a fundamental commitment to utilize special forces in large numbers. But this would soon change. In the spring of 1940, the German advance turned on the Low Countries and France. The cream of the British Army found itself surrounded. The unrelenting German assault against the Allies left the conventional British forces with little offensive capability. While the Royal Navy managed to rescue most of the Army's expeditionary force from the beaches of Dunkirk, little heavy equipment was salvaged. This basically left the Army with the clothes on the soldiers' backs and the rifles they were able to carry back to England. The Germans wasted no time consolidating their hold on the continent. Nazi engineers, using slave labor from the concentration camps, began building what was supposed to be an impenetrable Atlantic wall from the North Sea to the Pyrenees. The old ideas had failed, and Churchill sought answers even as the last of the survivors from Dunkirk were being lifted off the beaches. He asked the Imperial General Staff to determine the feasibility of raiding German-occupied Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, a South African, remembering the commandos used in the Boer War and their deadly harassment of the British, suggested that a new force of highly trained, highly mobile light infantry be developed for cross-channel raids. In June 1940, approval was given to establish a special service brigade made up of 5,000 men drawn from all services. Soon a combined operations headquarters was operational, and the commandos were in business. The British were not in a position to invade Europe in force, but they would be able to remind the Germans that the war was not over. It was not just pride that motivated the British. Tens of thousands of German troops could be tied up defending the long coastline of Western Europe, thus keeping them away from other battle fronts. The first raids were small operations, but they gave the commandos an opportunity to hone their skills in action. The ongoing commando raids proved an invaluable source of intelligence for the Allies. Considerable damage was done by sabotage teams, and the men were increasingly better armed and trained. But none of this was enough to shake the Nazi grip on Europe. The invasion of Europe would require moving massive numbers of troops across the Channel and landing on the beaches over a short period of time under direct German fire. Such an undertaking had never been attempted. The Allies would have to experiment. In July 1942, the commandos played a leading role in the raid on Dieppe. In essence, this raid was to determine the operational problems of mounting a full-scale invasion. It would be an excellent learning experience not only for the planners, but for the men involved, including the commandos. It was a near disaster. The Germans were well entrenched. The British and Canadian troops made it to the beaches but suffered high casualties. The reality of the situation was evident. Any invasion would be an extremely difficult and bloody operation. The men would have to quickly move off the beaches for an overall assault to succeed. The Soviets were desperate for the Western Allies to act. This would help lessen the onslaught they faced across the whole of Russia. The men who sacrificed their lives at Dieppe undoubtedly saved thousands of lives 2 years later during the Normandy invasion. The experience was a bitter one, but the raid served notice to the Germans that they would soon face a two-front war. The Commandos were soon back in action, however, this time in more familiar small boat raids on the French coast. They then spearheaded the invasion of Sicily. This was followed by landings on the Italian mainland. The Marine role was unique. The smaller units of the SAS, along with the espionage units of the American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, excelled at operating behind enemy lines. The Commandos, however, operated in larger groups and could, if necessary, act as conventional forces able to stand, fight, and hold ground. Their training and fitness was on a par with their more secretive colleagues, but they were able to serve as a highly mobile strike force, as well as part of the regular forces. The Marines played a key role in the invasion of France at Normandy. Some 10,000 men of the Corps were part of the assault force, including 5 Marine Commando units, engineers, and support groups. Some 2/3 of the landing craft were manned by Marines. The Allies needed every man for the final push across Europe. Each battle took the Marines further away from their natural sea-based environment. But it was their training and skill at handling small boats that served the Allies well. Every stream, river, and canal held by the Germans became a potential barrier to successful advance. Through the autumn of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, the Allied armies moved towards Berlin. The Commandos frequently worked with armored units in clearing isolated pockets of German resistance. This included removing anti-tank units hidden in ambush positions within swamps, woodlands, or the rubble of battle-scarred towns. The wetlands were particularly familiar ground for the small special teams of Commandos. These groups were the origin of the SBS, or Special Boat Squadron of the Royal Marines. Using canoes and collapsibles, these teams operated in enemy-held waters. During the war, the Green Beret was introduced for commando forces, the proudest symbol of achievement for the men in the Corps. The beret with its globe and laurel badge is still worn by the members of the Royal Marine Commando units. After the war, the British military, like those of most Allied nations, saw a massive demobilization. The Army disbanded their special forces, leaving the Royal Marines as the only force maintaining the commando structure and techniques. Their unique skills would soon be needed again. 6 years of war in Europe had meant many hardships. The Russians now brought down the Iron Curtain across Eastern Europe and challenged the Western Allies for global dominance. Russian-backed communist aggression seemed to face the Americans and British at almost every turn. The first real battle came in Korea in 1950. The Royal Marines served alongside the American Marine Corps in some of the most bitter fighting of that so-called limited war. Almost simultaneously, the Royal Marines were deployed in Malaya, where communist guerrillas confronted Commonwealth forces. The British faced special problems in these early engagements of the Cold War. Not only were they fighting the communists, they faced the rise of nationalism within their Commonwealth. While most moves towards independence in the empire were relatively peaceful, British forces were increasingly under fire from more radical elements. These nationalist forces, particularly when allied with the communists, created difficult and hostile situations. In 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, an Egyptian colonel who participated in a coup against the ruling family, became president of Egypt. He represented the new radical Arab nationalism sweeping through the region. Under his leadership, Egypt quickly moved to nationalize the Suez Canal. The British not only saw this as a challenge to their influence in the Middle East, but, more importantly, as a threat to their pipeline to the Persian Gulf's oil fields. The British and French, who faced an Arab revolt of their own in Algeria, decided to fight back, and Operation Musketeer was born. It was a mission perfectly suited for the Marines, a direct seaborne assault on a conventional objective, the canal. A number of the commando battalions trained for the operation. The Marines had developed new tactics to take advantage of helicopter transport, which was then emerging from its infancy as a useful military tool. But the bulk of the troops were deployed the old-fashioned way, from landing craft launched from mother ships. The Marines fought efficiently in battles centered at the mouth of the Nile around Port Said. Effective as the military operation might have been, the action in the Suez was a political disaster. The Americans, joined by the Russians, vocally denounced what they saw was a blatant form of neo-colonialism. The British and French were ultimately forced to withdraw. Suez marked the moment when Britain was forced to recognize that it would not be an equal partner with the two superpowers. Its military, political, and more importantly, economic power simply could not match that of the Americans or the Soviets. But Britain's remaining colonial and Commonwealth responsibilities meant the Marines would still be needed. In the mid-50s, nationalist guerrillas on Cyprus mounted a vicious campaign to oust the British. The Royal Marines were among the forces deployed to restore order. The Cyprus campaign dragged on for 5 long years. It proved to be an opportunity for the Marines to learn first-hand lessons in urban terrorism and the tactics to combat it, experience that would prove invaluable when they faced similar problems in Northern Ireland some years later. In 1960, the Marines developed the Commando ship, a converted aircraft carrier redesigned as a base for a battalion of Marines, including its own complement of helicopters. HMS Bulwark was the first of this type, soon followed by HMS Albion. With these two ships, the British could maintain a mobile force both in the Middle East and the Pacific. Bulwark and her Marines were tested in the Persian Gulf, when the government of Iraq threatened its small neighbor to the south, Kuwait. 2 commando units, along with HMS Bulwark and an RAF contingent, were quickly deployed. The show of force was enough for the Iraqi forces to back down. 20 years later, long after Britain had withdrawn from the region, the Iraqis would invade Kuwait. Aden was the focal point for British forces in the Middle East during the early 1960s. The colony was located at the tip of the Saudi Peninsula and dominated the approaches to the Red Sea and Suez Canal. Aden itself was embroiled in fighting between rival nationalist groups, while the British faced Egyptian-backed Marxist rebels in the mountainous area of the colony known as the Radfan. The Royal Marines, along with elements of the Parachute Regiment and the SAS, were deployed to this parched, desolate land. The rigors of the climate became as much of a challenge as the rebel tribesmen. From 1964 until the British withdrawal in 1967, the Marines fought hit-and-run battles in the Radfan. During one 2-month period, the Marines conducted some 300 patrols through the desert. Other elements of the Marines were engaged in urban warfare in the crowded streets of the city of Aden. At best, the British could only hope to contain the rebellion. In November, the last British forces left aboard Marine landing craft. The Marines served in nearby Oman, which also faced a rebellion by tribesmen. As the British Empire evolved into the British Commonwealth, Britain continued to offer security assistance to the newly independent former colonies. The so-called confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia in the mid-1960s was a prime example. The two nations, along with the British-supported Sultanate of Brunei, shared the island of Borneo. The Indonesians sought to dominate the oil-rich region, and a guerrilla war began along the long frontier between the former British colonies and Indonesia. The region is extremely mountainous and covered with thick jungle foliage. Perfect conditions for guerrilla operations. The Royal Marines were dispatched to the region. Ultimately, 2 commando units engaged the Indonesians. From late 1962 until mid-1966, the Marines fought an aggressive campaign under very trying conditions. Some operations entailed patrolling the mangrove swamps, rivers and waterways in assault boats, locally constructed longboats or canoes. The constant marching through the jungle created numerous medical problems. Techniques to overcome skin disease and intestinal ailments were constantly reviewed. The jungle bases faced as many attacks from rats as they did the Indonesians. In the end, the fighting simply subsided. It was not the kind of victory that called for parades and speeches, but it was the sort of successful campaign that the Royal Marines could proudly look back on. The end of the confrontation in Indonesia saw a major shift in the mission of the Royal Marines. There were problems at home.
Do not fire back for the moment!
The conflict in Northern Ireland has not been a traditional guerrilla war. It has been a combination of civil war, urban terrorism, and civil disturbance. The enemy is not often clearly defined. Since British troops were deployed to the province, soldiers, police, and Marines have faced onslaughts ranging from direct IRA attacks to children throwing petrol bombs. When the members of 41 Commando first went to Northern Ireland in September 1969, they were ill-equipped for urban warfare of the kind they found. They had none of the specialized riot gear that has now become standard issue to soldiers on duty there. Sadly, but inevitably, the Marines adapted to the perils of their new mission. The Marines developed efficient methods for patrolling. Usually moving about in groups of 4, men in the patrol kept constant watch over their comrades while keeping an eye on the civilians around them. Surreal scenes of heavily armed soldiers and Marines intermingled with townspeople going about their daily routines have become all too familiar in Northern Ireland. The servicemen face incredible pressure on all fronts. There is the obvious element of danger, which their training helps them deal with. But they're also engaged in activities where one false move can result in a riot and the deaths of innocent civilians. Patrolling the streets on foot or in a Land Rover is an experience few Marines forget. The routine of dreary duty on the streets of Belfast and Derry was suddenly interrupted with the Argentine invasion of the Falkland Islands in April 1982. The Marines on duty there took the brunt of the initial assault. Within hours, notice had gone out for 3 Commando Brigade to be ready to sail within 3 days. Men hastily dropped whatever they were doing and assembled at assigned duty stations. Hundreds of hours of practice had prepared the men for such action, but this was no drill. They were ready on schedule. 4,000 men and thousands of tons of supplies were on their way to the South Atlantic. The long voyage gave the men an opportunity to get organized for the assault. Equipment was readied and endless exercises conducted to keep the men in peak fighting condition. The special boat squadron teams and members of the SAS landed ahead of the main force to undertake vital reconnaissance missions. A direct assault on the entrenched Argentinians in the capital city of Stanley had been ruled out. Instead, the Marines went ashore with army units at San Carlos. It took several days of marching across rugged mountains to reach Stanley. The loss of the transport ship Atlantic Conveyor and her supply of helicopters meant the Marines and Paras would have to carry all their equipment on their backs and cross the mountain on foot. Each load weighed over 100 pounds. The force march was called the Yomp. It was brutal, but their superb physical condition and a high degree of motivation made the whole task relatively easy. Veterans of the battle recall that in many ways it was simply an extension of their training, except this was war. Equipment, weapons and tactics generally worked, but there were complaints about the quality of their boots in the cold, soggy bogs of the islands. A series of bitter and sometimes brief firefights with the Argentinians followed, and the Marines more than held their own. British casualties were 255 killed and over 750 wounded. 27 of those killed and just over 100 of the wounded were Royal Marines. But this was a successful campaign, professionally and efficiently executed. Today, the Royal Marines are Britain's primary amphibious assault force. More than 6,000 officers and men serve full-time with some 1,000 men in a reserve component. The fighting heart of the Marines is 3 Commando Brigade, comprised of 40, 42 and 45 Commando units, along with aviation, engineer, artillery and logistical elements. The SBS, Special Boat Squadron, much like the Army Special Air Service, the SAS, is one of Britain's most secret organisations. A small but highly trained group of volunteers, they are assigned missions that can seldom be publicly discussed. Among their openly assigned responsibilities are providing security for Britain's nuclear deterrent equipment and patrolling the waters around Northern Ireland, maintaining a close watch on attempts to smuggle weapons, ammunition and explosives to the IRA. The SBS also keeps an eye on the North Sea oil installations to guard against possible acts of sabotage. The SBS takes on assignments wherever its unique waterborne fighting, infiltration and reconnaissance talents can be useful. Only 30% of SBS volunteers make it through the selection process. Whether in the SBS, serving on a landing craft or Royal Navy ship, or part of the regular commando units, each Royal Marine must go through an extensive training experience beginning in Lympstone near Exeter along Britain's southern coast. This thorough and exacting training lasts some 30 weeks. It is the longest infantry training course in the Western world. Annually, nearly 1,000 young men endure what has been termed the Lympstone experience. But before a recruit is accepted into the main course, he must first pass the demanding 3-day potential recruit course held at the training centre. The purpose of this course is twofold. First, it gives the would-be Marine a chance to glimpse military life, and it enables the veteran trainers of the Corps to have a close look at the recruit. During the 3 days, there are personal interviews, a battery of academic tests, and a series of physical challenges. And, as always, an introduction to that all-important aspect of military life, marching. These potential Marines are given a chance to talk with some of the men finishing up the course. This is an opportunity for the new men and the Marines to make a final decision about who will be invited back to the full course. When the new recruits return to Lympstone, they meet other members of the new troop. These are men who over the years will learn to rely on each other in life and death situations. It is a time when friendships of a lifetime are forged. But first, there is the ever-present paperwork that must be completed. The first night the Marines are at Lympstone, they meet their new commanding officer and are sworn in. Once these formalities are out of the way, the men continue preparations for life as a Marine with a haircut, 2 pairs of boots, and a new set of clothes. The first 2 weeks of training are known as the induction phase. This serves as an introduction to service life, including the background and traditions of the Corps. The men are taught how to carry themselves properly, to maintain high standards. Regular inspections become part of the routine. Physical fitness is crucial. By the first weekend, the men go on their first deployment in the field to build a camp and learn basic survival techniques. The next 13 weeks are spent teaching the individual skills to be a Royal Marine Commando. Throughout, the training is progressive. The expectation is each individual will be pushed to his personal limits. The men are worked hard as individuals and in teams. Slowly, the recruits begin to look and march like soldiers. They are introduced early to the tools of the trade. The SA-80 assault rifle is the standard issue personal weapon. They're taught how to strip, reassemble and use the weapon. More specialized training is introduced after the 7th week of the course. The recruits are introduced to compasses and map reading. Though equipped with the most modern navigation tools, the Marines are careful not to be too reliant on technology. The men are expected to survive and fight with the most basic equipment. Field exercises are used to teach camouflage techniques and the art of concealment. New weapons are introduced. At the 10-week mark, training intensifies. The men are taught to work with helicopters and endure a 4-day survival exercise where they're expected to live off the land. Tests are then taken on the whole range of skill they've been taught to date. The next phase of training concentrates on combat team skills. By this point, the fundamentals are expected to be second nature. The men are introduced to the details of tactical warfare, being able to think and fight under a variety of circumstances. The training moves to Dartmoor. Live fire exercises add an element of realism and danger to the manoeuvres. By the 24th week, the men are considered fit and experienced enough to wear the coveted green beret for the first time. There is an introduction to unarmed combat, and 4 days will be spent on resource and initiative training. The next step is training in amphibious operations and the handling of landing craft and small boats. The final exercise is designed to bring together all that which the Marine has learned over the previous 6 months. It is held under realistic and challenging circumstances and lasts 7 hard days and nights. The final exercise over, there is one more hurdle for the men. They must pass the traditional commando test, which originated with the 1st Commandos in World War II, and includes a 9-mile speed march that must be concluded in 90 minutes, a grueling endurance course, a 2-mile obstacle course, followed by a 4-mile run to the firing range where the Marine is expected to hit the target at least 6 times within 10 shots. The taxing assault course must be completed in 13 minutes. All this is followed by the infamous 30-mile march across Dartmoor in 8 hours. As with all other tests, this is carried out with full equipment, a load of over 30 pounds. The result is sometimes painful, but an intensely proud moment for the men who complete it.
Marines! To your duties! Quick! March!
Graduation ceremonies complete these long weeks of hard work, and the men are officially awarded their Green Berets.
Tests, especially with the 84 and final exercise as well. Congratulations, Marine Beacon.
These men are now assigned to jobs within the commando units. But training hardly ceases. It continues throughout the career of the Royal Marine. These men are corporals, combat veterans of Northern Ireland and deployments to the Middle East. In preparation for the sergeant's course, they must undergo a rigorous refresher course in basic combat tactics. First, it's a long march out from Oakhampton Camp on the edge of Dartmoor. The men, as always, march in full combat kit. The rendezvous point is deep in the moors. The Marines take a break and prepare for the exercise in earnest. The exercise is focused on a squad of men in a valley facing a sniper. A supervising sergeant outlines the tactical situation. The objective is to ferret out the sniper and kill or capture him.
One section, listen in. You've just been involved in a troop attack at OP-17. And as part of the reorganisation, the troop commander noticed fleeting enemy coming down into this gorge. One section has been given the task of moving down into the gorge and clearing the gorge forward of where you are now. Your access is the stream bed. Any pockets or small pockets of enemy you come across, he's told you to take them out yourself and report back to him, giving him a sit rep at each stage. Section commander, when you're ready, shake your men out, give them QBOs and let them go.
Leaders are selected and the patrol moves out.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. 1 to 5, Charlie team. 6 to 10, Delta team. Okay. Man move. Move!
The sniper keeps a close eye on the Marines who are uncertain as to where or when he will strike. The sergeants keep a close eye on the men, observing their techniques in moving through hostile territory. Once the sniper opens fire, the team leaders must deploy their men quickly to avoid casualties. The initial goal is to disperse the men, but still maintain unit cohesion.
Watch! Watch! Shoot! Watch! And shoot! Stop there! Stop there! Charlie, go firm! Delta!
Once the men are under cover, they must determine the sniper's location and then strike against him. The maneuver must be carefully executed. These men know that the price for carelessness on the streets of Belfast may mean death for a fellow Marine, an innocent civilian, or themselves.
Hello, Zero, this is 1-1, Charlie, contact. Look there, okay.
Gary! Gary! Go right!
Move left!
The men close in on the sniper. Following each exercise, the men's actions are evaluated and suggestions made for improvement.
Yeah, there's a bit. Right. The fire control went right out the window, didn't it, on that one, I'm afraid? Right, there was guys just, you know, they were on rock and roll, they were cabbing. And basically that is what you as commanders have got to stop. Because they'll do that, they'll just, there's guys out of ammunition now, you've only done 2 attacks. You know, there was such a volume of fire going down there, Christ, anything, you know, about this big in this valley, it'd be dead by now. There's that many rounds going down. The section command, sounds good. The section commanders must control the fire. It's all well and good winning the firefight, but it's no good if you've got nothing to, you know, when you get to the other end.
The Marines work with a minimum of formality. Each one of these corporals knows his job and has done it well. Emphasis is placed on tactical skills. The Marines know this is what will win battles and ultimately save lives. Training goes on far beyond Dartmoor. The Marines today are deployed throughout the world, from continental Europe to the Middle East and to Hong Kong. In the colony, a marine boat detachment maintains surveillance on the miles of coastline and waterways around Hong Kong Island and the new territories. Smuggling is a primary concern, both of illegal immigrants and illicit goods. As the colony moves towards independence from Britain, tensions are rising. The Marines, along with the Gurkha detachment, provide an element of security during an otherwise potentially tense transition time. The Marines must be both diplomats and policemen. It is an important duty in this remnant of imperialism. The role of the Marines in the rest of Asia continues to be important as well. They regularly train in the oil-rich Sultanate of Brunei. Exercise Curry Trail takes place every 2 years in these steaming jungles. It's an opportunity for the Marines to get invaluable training in difficult conditions. It also reminds nations in the region that Britain is an ally that has teeth to back up its foreign policy. The troopers settle in for a 6-week deployment. The first week is spent learning how to survive in the jungle. This includes learning how to trap wild animals for food.
Either side, we channel the animal into our trap. Obviously, you can't go through here, he'll take the easiest route through. The animal comes along, trips the wire, which pulls the trigger off. So, that's it. Right, we move on to one of the bigger traps now, which is meant for a monkey. The monkey, being quite a switched-on animal, would take the easiest route to get to the food. So what he'd do, hopefully, is walk along this log, place his arm and head through there, or maybe just his arm, and he'd take whatever bait you'd left on this rattan hoop here. Obviously, if you leave a banana on there, that'd be ideal. So the monkey comes along, puts his head and arm through here, and starts trying to pull the banana off the hoop. Once the hoop moves, he gets his neck broken as the log falls down.
But these men are not here just to survive. They must be able to fight in the dense forests. They must remember all of their soldierly skills while adapting to the demands of life on the jungle trail. Crossing a crocodile-infested river becomes an intense experience. These men must rely on their own muscle and wits, much as their fathers and uncles did in the earlier campaign Britain fought in this region. The undergrowth is thick. The Marines practice what they call cross-grading, crossing the rivers and ridges at cross angles in order to surprise their enemy. The Marines move in virtual silence. Commands are given by hand signal, and as often as not, commands are not even necessary. Each man knows what is expected of him. The men prepare for an action. The situation is laid out by their sergeant, a situation that may be an exercise today, but a reality tomorrow.
The situation in this country has severely deteriorated in the last 48 hours. An extremist, reactionary, subversive force is threatening to overthrow the present government. The present government, being friendly with the British, has asked for armed support which has been granted. Bravo Company is part of that expeditionary force which has been sent to hopefully quell the rebellion before it gets underway. Information about the terrorists suggests that they're resilient, resourceful, determined, and because of their radical and fanatical beliefs, are quite prepared to die in the fight.
Okay, moving to the dirt.
In the Middle East, the Marines were prominent in Operation Safe Haven at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. Thousands of Kurdish refugees fled into the hills of northern Iraq along the Turkish border, escaping persecution from Saddam Hussein after rebelling against Iraqi control. The world watched in horror as hundreds of people were dying of starvation and disease. The Royal Marines joined in the multinational effort both to give protection to the Kurds, but also to build shelter, provide food, and medical attention. In recent years, the Marines have been closely associated with the defense of Norway, assigned by NATO to protect its northern flank. The end of the Cold War has not lessened the importance of this mission. Uncertainty in the former Soviet Union's republics keeps Western military planners busy trying to anticipate the next crisis point. The Marines remain vigilant in this theatre. In the event of trouble, it is expected that the bulk of Marine units would move by ship to the north. Deployment would not be easy. The mountains and snow of Arctic regions present a challenge year-round. In places, the snow never melts and the ground remains frozen and hard as concrete. This makes digging in very difficult, requiring power tools and explosives. But the snow and ice can be used to advantage. The Marines learn to make the best of what is available to them. With ingenuity and imagination, blocks made from frozen water and straw can be used to construct ice bunkers that provide excellent cover against enemy fire. The men constantly practice maneuvers and deployments on skis. Moving cross-country in the Arctic is a hostile and unpredictable environment. The men must still be able to fight under these conditions. The mission of the Marines is not just to provide security in pre-designated theatres. They are prepared to serve virtually anywhere and under any condition. They are supported with an aviation wing equipped with Lynx and Gazelle helicopters, along with a Commando Royal Artillery unit of 105mm lightweight cannons. Landing craft can carry tanks and fast-moving Land Rovers to virtually any beachhead. On the ground, the Commandos carry their basic SA-80 assault rifle and are supported by anti-tank rockets, handheld anti-aircraft missiles, and 81mm mortars. Engineering elements give the Marines the flexibility to move quickly, even if terrain or man-made objects stand in the way. The key to success for the Commandos is being able to deliver men and equipment quickly into hostile situations. As an integral part of the Royal Navy, the Marines are supported by Royal Navy amphibious assault ships and landing craft. The Marines pride themselves on being a self-sustaining operation. The Commando Logistics Regiment of the Royal Marines is responsible for keeping the fighting men in action. They provide transport, ordnance, and workshop support. The regiment is organized into 5 squadrons to carry out these functions. The primary role of the transport squadron is to move combat supplies such as ammunition, fuel, and food from the base support depot to the forward areas. Generally, supplies are distributed under cover at night. The regiment's specialized vehicles, such as fuel trucks, are designed to carry massive amounts quickly and under combat conditions. The medical squadron is capable of fielding 50-bed dressing stations which can be used as field hospitals. An ambulance troop provides emergency transport. Casualties can be quickly evacuated from the frontline areas. The squadron trains to operate under a variety of conditions, including the Arctic. Modern warfare makes tremendous demands upon equipment, and as the Gulf War proved, sometimes battles are measured in hours rather than days. It is critical that equipment and men be kept moving. The workshop squadron provides the support the Marines need to stay in battle. The squadron is capable of repairing and recovering virtually all of the Commando's equipment. Support troops provide backup services in rear areas or close to the front lines. The workshop teams are fully self-supporting, carrying all the tools and spare parts they need to keep the combat Marines fighting. All of this requires a sophisticated supply system. Modern management techniques, inventory controls, and maintenance programs are used to keep track of the thousands of pieces of equipment the regiment is responsible for. These men expect to be able to defend themselves. They are all combat qualified and trained to fight, as well as perform their logistic roles. Among British forces, this combined service regiment is a good example of cooperation among the services supporting the combat soldier and Marine. The Royal Marine Band is one of the oldest and most respected elements in the Corps. The British military and naval establishment has steadily reduced in size since the Second World War. But numbers alone do not make for an effective warrior force. The motivation, training, and bravery of these men has more than proven that a dedicated force can project power far beyond what simple statistics indicate. The Royal Marines will continue to be prepared, as their motto states: per mare, per terram, by sea, by land.
Left, right, 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 left, right,